Good afternoon, and welcome to Steps, Giant Leaps, Engineering Lessons from Apollo. Now, this talk is not about that took human beings to the moon in 1969. That's you can go, you can read it. And there are even pull requests that people have submitted to it after it was published last year. Someone submitted a mission profile to go and rescue Matt Damon from Mars. And somebody else submitted one that it took a couple of days for enthusiasts to figure out what it did, and then they worked out that it would have stopped the oxygen tank on Apollo 13 from exploding. So there you go. Mission patches 48 years too late. Go software industry.
But keep that in mind, it's never too late to do the right thing.
But I got the idea for this talk. A year before last, I saw this guy. So this is Brian Cox, who's a science presenter from the UK, and Colonel Buzz Aldrin, the second man to walk on the moon. They did a thing at the Space Museum, the Science Museum in London. And, Aldrin is amazing. He's in his 80s, and he's still working full-time on human spaceflight and getting people to Mars and all this kind of stuff. And one of the things he said in that talk is he was so frustrated at how kind of spaceflight had gone backwards. In the 1970s, if the US wanted to go to the moon, they just launched a rocket and did it. And today, if the US wants to go to space, they have to hitch a lift with the Russians or ask Elon Musk for a favor. And this kind of started me thinking, because there was all this amazing stuff that they did in the 1960s and 70s as part of the moon landing program. And I was like, how much of that is valuable lessons for, engineering and big projects and stuff that maybe we've also forgotten how to do. I was playing around with this idea, and then this man, Kevlin, was here on this stage last year with a talk called 1968, and I thought, bugger, Kevin has stolen my talk idea without me knowing it, and he's doing a talk about space travel, because I know he's also a massive, spaceflight nerd and stuff. And I saw the talk, and it was brilliant, and it was nothing to do with space travel, and so I said afterwards, should we do this as a thing? And he said yes, because...
I will say there was Lithuanian beer involved.
Yes.
Which is probably why I said yes. And yes, it was
and so basically we kind of threw together all of our own enthusiasm and ideas and, just cool engineering geek stuff from the Apollo moon landing program. And we put together the format for the talk. We're going to give you a countdown. We're going to count down from 10 to...
10 to 0, so that's 11. So the dial goes all the way up to 11 on our talk, okay? You get 11.
Of spaceflight. And we're going to share some of the lessons that we think we can all learn from... Is my microphone switching?
Your microphone is switching in and out.
Ed.
Is there a hopeful... he's gesturing. Where
he's gesturing. I need to do this, apparently. We'll figure this out. Let's try that. Is that better? That's lovely.
Okay, excellent.
Cool. They had this problem in space, by the way.
Yeah.
That's just part of the show. That's mission control back there.
Yeah.
We're the Gemini astronauts up here.
Yeah. This is your authentic astronaut experience.
So the first sort of lesson that we want to talk about is this one. Strategy, vision, and roadmap. Now, in, when was it? 1958. The Soviet Union put
57.
This
October
57.
57.
They put this thing in orbit, Sputnik I, and this took the entire world by surprise because nobody had any idea that anybody was close to launching something into orbit around the planet Earth. This was for the whole Cold War thing, which plays very heavily into the space race. This was a massive victory for the Soviet Union. Because Americans could go outside, and what's the quote from the journalist? It doesn't matter whether they believe the newspapers or not. You could go outside with a radio.
You could see it on a clear, but you could hear it. So there's no questions. People putting fake news about it. It's just like, yep, this is the real deal.
Go outside. Beep.
There's also something else that's interesting about this because the Soviets were struggling with getting a good design. What they did, this is a classic example we should learn for software, is they pared it right back. All the original Sputnik designs were far more complex. This is as simple as it gets. It bleeps, it transmits, it is your proof of concept. The goal is not to put something clever up there, it's to put something up there.
It's about this big, and they polished it till it shone like a mirror, so that all it had to do was reflect sunlight, and you'd be able to see it. Really, really
you can hear it, you can see
design.
It, that's all you need. So therefore, that's your minimum viable product.
So this went into orbit, and everyone else got a little bit frightened. And then April 61, Gagarin?
Yep, 12th of April, 1961, 4 years, 3.5 years later. That's and he went in full orbits, and this again stole the march. There was this sense of desperation. In fact, something the Americans had a number of disastrous explosive failures. Kaputnik, yes, was. You can find these are the kind of videos that people sort of show you of rockets exploding. A lot of those are the Kaputniks, and I think the first one was Vanguard 1. And it's just like, yeah, they were falling way behind.
But the interesting thing, of course, about the moon landing, I mean, this is a memo from 1961. This is a week after Gagarin. And this is a memo from Vice President Lyndon Johnson, which is basically saying, we need to win something. We need to be first at something. And, you know, they did not care about the moon. There was no good scientific or engineering reason to go to the moon. There was nothing on the moon that anybody really wanted. They needed a propaganda victory. And literally, this memo here, do we have a chance of beating the Soviets by putting a laboratory in space, or a trip around the moon, or a rocket to land on the moon, or a rocket to go to the moon and back? And, you know, this is really important to understand, because what we're talking about here is what's the strategic objective and how are we going to do it? And you go round and round in engineering planning. What's the objective? How? What? How? What do we need to do? We need to score a propaganda victory. How? Well, here are our options. Let's go with the moon. And at that point, it goes back to, right, what are we doing? We're landing on the moon. How do we do it? Well, that's NASA's problem. Yeah. Oh, but we haven't invented NASA yet. All right, let's invent NASA.
Oh, just in case Toma is in the audience, because he asked me yesterday, where did I get my T-shirt? California Space Center for today's. Okay, just so you know.
Now, once you've made a decision, you have to tell people what it is you're going to do. You need to let them know what's in scope, what's the purpose of the project, what's in, what's out.
I therefore ask the Congress, above and beyond the increases I have earlier requested for space activities, to provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
Now let's just dig into that quote, one of the most famous speeches. You remember when the president used to ask Congress before they did stupid, expensive things? Wasn't that nice? I believe that this nation should commit itself. It's not giving orders, it's inclusive. This nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out.
There's your deadline.
Now, at this point, America had been in space for 15 minutes, total. And the president just stood up and said, we're going to the moon by the end of the decade. You know why they chose the end of the decade?
Ah, yes.
The Russians, the CIA believed the Russians couldn't get there before that. So Kennedy had to give them a deadline, which was the longest deadline possible. They had a lot of problems to solve, but if they left it too long, they were going to be second, and then they would lose, and they'd fail to achieve the strategic objective. Now, there's just one more thing I want to mention about this. Landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
I guess there's two things there.
Now, one of them, you know, a lot of people say, oh, that's how people wrote in the 1970s. It's really not. If you want to put a human being on the moon, you send a woman, because they are lighter, and in space, every gram of mass is really, really expensive. But NASA was not prepared to go there, and there was no good reason other than politics and misogyny why they didn't. This is Jerry Cobb. She died this year. She qualified as a pilot when she was 12 years old. She was part of a program called, the Mercury 13?
Mercury 13, yeah. So the guy who actually put together the medical program and the tests for NASA basically ran a parallel one for women. The 7 astronauts, the Mercury 7, are the ones that we remember. The Mercury 13 are the ones that we've forgotten.
And yeah, who knows, maybe we would have got there sooner if NASA had put women in space instead of men. But yeah, so when people say it's just inclusive language, no, there was all kinds of stupid politics involved in that. Once you've made your decision, you've got to reinforce it, because people start going, should we really be doing this? Did we make the right decision? And that's where we get this, one of the most famous political speeches in
There
history.
is no strife, no prejudice, no national conflict in outer space as yet. Its hazards are hostile to us all. Its conquest deserves the best of all mankind, and its opportunity for peaceful cooperation may never come again. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
So, just a reminder in case you wonder what a president can sound like.
But you know, that idea, once somebody's made a decision and committed to it, the people responsible for that decision have got to reinforce it. You've got to remind everyone what they're doing. Don't let people lose sight of the reason why you're having to put all this work and this effort into the thing you're trying to accomplish. All right, counting down, 9, hiring the right people.
You need the right people. It's not enough just to have a big vision, a strategy. It's not a command. You need people to actually embody that with the appropriate skill and the appropriate passion. And although people tend to focus on the astronauts, it's worth keeping in mind that ultimately 400,000 people, which is larger than the population of Iceland, were involved in putting those people on the moon. There were 12 astronauts who walked the surface of the moon, but 400,000 people were involved.
And all of those people knew. So the really interesting thing, 400,000 people on a project, and every single one of them knew what they were trying to do, and they knew what success looked like. When Armstrong set foot on the moon, 400,000 people were like, we did that, we made that happen. One of the really interesting management techniques they used was they sent the astronauts on these publicity tours, and they'd go into places like, there was a glue factory in Delaware that made the paste they used to hold the rubber seals on the helmets. And the astronaut would stand up in front of all these blue-collar workers working in this glue factory and basically say, please do your jobs well or I'll die. And then go back to NASA, and all these people would be like, wow, if we make a mistake with our glue, we might kill an astronaut. But then when they did it, all the glue factory people were like, that's our glue. Our glue's walking on the moon.
And I met that person. That's another thing. So you've got to show your face. There's a relationship you're building here.
Now, we want to just show you NASA's diversity hiring program.
Oh yeah, this is ultimate diversity.
So the guy in the middle here smoking the pipe, he's the token diversity hire because everyone else was a cigarette smoker.
Okay, so that's your diversity.
Now, there are lots of photographs like this in NASA's archive. There were an awful lot of white guys in white shirts with these black ties and everything. But there were also some pioneering figures in all kinds of things. The movie Hidden Figures came out last year, tells the story of some of them. There was this balance, because on the one hand, America in the 1960s was kind of very constrained in its thinking about diversity and feminism, but also they needed to get this thing done. And there were people like, we don't care, race, color, gender, we don't care. Get the right people in or the Russians are going to beat us to the moon. These were computers?
Computers, but they were also called computresses.
Computresses.
If you want to really mangle the English language.
Because, NASA at the 1960s, computer was a job title that was given to people who did calculations, because they didn't have electrical computers yet.
They had a few, but not that many. It was still, the word was still in flux. If you said computer, you'd probably have to distinguish it by saying electronic computer.
One of them actually, Poppy Northcutt, actually made it into mission control. This is her on one of the Gemini missions, 1968.
Yeah, she joined, she was involved in the Gemini missions. She also calculated the return trajectory for Apollo 8, which is kind of important because that was the first one to go out that far. You kind of need to come back. She was 25 at the time. She was a hell of an engineering geek. She would actually take the code. She didn't just do the calculations. She took the code home to figure out. She wasn't trusting, she'd go the next day and say, okay, why is this like this? I'm trying to understand what the code is doing in relation to the equations, and she wasn't taking anything on trust. She did this thoroughly. She earned her place there. There was one of those cases of, we need people who can do the job, and although there was a glass ceiling, it was just like, there was a little bit of give there because we need to get to the moon was the overriding mission.
They need to get to the moon. NASA was a young organization. It didn't have the entrenched power structures of something like the military. Very, very consciously a civilian organization. A lot of the pilots, the astronauts, were military pilots, but Neil Armstrong wasn't. He was never served in the armed forces. And so there were these kind of rare opportunities that didn't exist anywhere else for people who didn't fit the conventional stereotype to become a pivotal part of this accomplishment.
There are other aspects. Those who were pilots were not simply just test pilots. You have people like Aldrin, who actually got a PhD, 1963. Basically, he invented the way we dock. So his work is still in use today. So he was not just a pilot. These were the people that they chose. These were the people
who trained for jobs that didn't exist yet because that's how badly they wanted to go into space. Neil Armstrong had a pilot's license before he had a driver's license. He qualified as a pilot on his 16th birthday with money he saved working in a car wash. Let's talk about approaches.
So
considering approaches.
Nobody's done this before. How are you going to, you can't say, this is how they went to the moon, let's copy that. How are you going to do this? You need to evaluate alternative approaches. And the reason we've got this Tintin image here is because this was very much the orthodox view.
This is not actually the moon rocket, is it? This is
I'm going to have to disappoint you there. Yeah, it's not there. But this was the orthodox view, informed by science fiction and all the imagery of the time. It's your classic fins down, the whole rocket goes. And that's how people thought about it.
Rocket goes down, the ladder comes out. Now, there were 3 different approaches that were proposed for how to get to the moon and come back. It's actually interesting, the whole getting back from the moon, at one point, that was optional. Like, there was no shortage of people involved with NASA and the spaceflight program who were like, it is our duty to die for our country. If you send us to the moon and don't bring us back, that's all right, we'll take one for the team. And Kennedy, with his, we'll land a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth, he's like, no, that's out of scope. Yeah. You are not selling our customer data to make a profit. We have standards, we have ethics. We are not leaving an American to die on the moon, no matter if we manage to do it first. So they had these kind of 3 approaches.
So the direct approach is what you just saw there. It was what everybody thought. We're going to take the rocket to the moon, and then we're going to come back. And that seems very simple at one level, very logical.
But the biggest problem they had with the direct ascent, when you return to the Earth, you need fuel to slow down. And to do a direct ascent, you need to take that fuel, which you're not going to need for 2 weeks. You need to take it all the way to the moon and all the way back again. So every time you try and do anything, you have these tons of rocket fuel you don't need yet kind of sat on your back, weighing you down. It's kind of like when you bootstrap a software project and you do npm install this, and suddenly you can't move anymore because you're carrying so much baggage that you don't actually need until you go into production, 2-3 weeks, maybe months later. And so the direct ascent approach was ruled out because basically you had to carry everything with you all the way, even stuff you weren't going to need right until the last seconds of that mission. So the 2 alternatives here, the one in the middle was the Earth orbit rendezvous. They basically put everything in orbit around the Earth, stick it all together, and then that goes and lands on the moon.
Yeah, and that was quite popular. That was also, you saw that in science fiction as well, but not necessarily the movie stuff. That was more the written stuff. We're going to use multiple launches. We're going to assemble a craft in orbit, perhaps even via a space station. That was the vision, and then you do direct from there. So you don't, that's a little bit better, and they kind of took elements of that in the final design. But then there was the last one, Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. And that's an interesting one, because that was not initially very popular, and there was one man, John Hobart, who eventually convinced Wernher von Braun to do this. And that is, we're going to go there, and we're going to orbit, we're going to separate the bit that lands, and then we're going to come back up. And therefore, we won't have to take all of the fuel down to the surface and then bring it back up. But
when you put it that way, it sounds like quite a good idea. But when you put it as, we are going to dock 2 spacecraft
which
a quarter of a million miles away from the Earth, which we've never done before, we can't practice, we don't get any kind of dress rehearsal, and there's no environment where we can simulate those exercises accurately, it sounds quite controversial. I mean, it took Hubert a couple of years to get people to take this seriously. But that's the approach they used. That's the approach that got them to the moon.
And you can see here the compelling case, the difference between these 2 approaches in terms of what you would have to take down. Now, you may recognize the top of the thing on the left. This is part of the direct ascent approach. And that looks like that design, that shape. The service module and command module, that was fairly well fixed very early on. But you can see all the rest of that stuff. What's that doing? It's doing nothing.
Fuel.
It's just fuel. So this is ultimately one of the things that kind of won over.
And there was, one other challenge with having the command module on the top of a 65-foot rocket is when you land on the moon.
You've now got to climb down. So when Kennedy was saying, why do we climb Everest, I don't think he was trying to suggest that the astronauts should also be climbers, because that's massively precarious. You can just see their little steps, little footholds. And this pretty much scuppers the whole idea of, and bring him back safely. I mean, this is a high-risk approach.
Imagine going to the moon and then slipping on that ladder. You got to remember, you're carrying a moon suit at this point, which weighs about 200 kilograms. If you lose your handhold, you're going to be like, oh, oops. I mean, you'll fall quite slowly, but you'll still struggle to get back up. So they went with the Lunar Orbit Rendezvous and stripped it right down, every single stage of the mission. So this is Armstrong and Aldrin. By the way, who took this picture, Kevlin?
Oh my God! Maybe they were faked. Maybe there's
this Kubrick in his studio.
Yeah, obviously.
So you see the lunar excursion module here on the left, and the only bit of that actually went back up into orbit was the little bit at the top. So all the legs, the landing engines, everything, all that's still on the moon. There's 6 of them still up there that I hope one day we can find and turn into a museum, because that would be pretty cool. But literally at every step, they're like, right, what don't we need anymore? Dump it, dump it, dump it. Fuel tanks, dump them in the sea. Service module, dump it in orbit. LEM, leave it on the moon. The only bit that comes back is that little command module with the 3 astronauts inside it and the big orange parachutes on the top.
Yeah, very modular, very focused. But then we've got another challenge here. All of these things have still not been done. At the point that Kennedy said this, the US didn't even have anybody who'd been in orbit. The best they'd managed was Alan Shepard in suborbit. So they didn't actually have anybody. They hadn't put one person in orbit. They put a couple of people in space. Nobody had been into orbit. They had not put 2 people into orbit. They had not put 3 people into orbit. They had never stepped outside of a spacecraft. They had never docked 2 spacecraft together. In other words, there is a series of things that we do not know how to do, but in order to achieve the mission, we have to know how to do. And that was basically the premise of all of the Gemini missions. There were 10 crewed Gemini missions, and each one of these went through and said, what's the next thing we haven't done? Right, we're doing that. Whether it was docking, whether it was EVA, all of these things, one at a time. And then they did the same with the Apollo launches. It was 11 that landed. Yeah. They didn't have, after the disaster, what was post-designated as Apollo 1, those were all uncrewed launches up until Apollo 7. That was the first one with humans. That was just like, okay, just get it into orbit and people back safely.
And the other thing about this is they shipped all their milestones. All the things they did for real. So Gemini, Gemini 1 was the first time they had 2 people in space, and they went to space. Gemini 2 was the first time they'd flown with a hydrogen fuel cell on board, so they didn't have to rely on batteries. Gemini 7 was the one they sent Jim Lovell and Frank Borman to see if humans could survive in space for 14 days. And apparently at the end of it, they absolutely stank. And the rescue crew who opened the thing when they splashed down are like, you never smelled anything like it. But they'd done it. And every single one of these missions, Apollo 8, they were supposed to be testing the docking capability, but one of the components wasn't ready. So they said, well, we have enough to send them round the moon, they just can't land. And that was where they did that famous The Christmas Eve broadcast.
Yeah. And that was one of the most important missions, because at that point, the lunar lander was not ready. The next in line should have been what became Apollo 9, which was, we're going to try out the assembly in low Earth orbit. And then somebody said, well, wait a minute, we could send humans on what was the first deep space mission. We'd been hovering around a couple of 100 kilometers above the Earth. To send people 400,000 kilometers is non-trivial. And that was, as you say, the Christmas broadcast. And that gave us some of the first proper amazing image of Earthrise. And that was profound. And it was a case of like, right, let's do that. And each single one. So that 9 was the full assembly, 10 was the full dress rehearsal. That was just like everything except actually landing on the moon.
There is a great story. The commander of Apollo 10 was a guy called Tom Stafford. he's like the most famous astronaut you've never heard of. He's brilliant. He's the person who reached through the airlock and shook Alexei Leonov's hand on the first joint American-Soviet mission. And rumors persist that they deliberately did not put enough fuel on board to land because they thought Colonel Stafford might go for it if he got close enough.
It was really close. It's just like he might just steal that. And we'll come back to that one a bit later, what that would have meant.
All right, so counting down. 6.
Now,
naming things matters.
As developers, you know this. But there's something else here, is that it is very easy to end up with very dull names of things. And when you're dealing with a project, we have ended up with, these days, with the ISS, which is surprisingly dull as a name. There's no inspiration. All these other things, Gemini, it has classical references. It also plays up on the word two. You've got the notion of Apollo. There we are, appealing to mythology and the moon. All of these things, these are names that are in some way inspiring and relatively abstract, but everybody can get behind them. The current launch system that NASA are going to be using, SLS, that's kind of a bit dull. Naming matters. So when it came to actually doing the names, here's something you didn't hear. Okay, they did not land and say, 1969-05C has landed. Nor did they say, Apollo 11 LM, this is one of the other official designations, /EASEP has landed. LM, Lunar Module, EASAP refers to the scientific package that they left on the moon.
But one of the beautiful details here is the crews chose their own missions, their own names, their own call signs. And so when this famous broadcast, Houston, Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed, they'd chosen the name Eagle, and NASA didn't know about Tranquility Base, did they?
So they knew about Eagle, they knew about Columbia, they had all of those names, but Tranquility Base, that was not, that was kind of the first time anybody had heard it was when they said Tranquility Base here, except for one other person who knew. That was
Charlie Duke,
who's CAPCOM, we'll get to him later, but he'd been primed by Aldrin and Armstrong, say, we're going to say this.
Now, when we say that the crews could name their own missions, there was a bit of kind of limitation put around it, because the mission prior to this one, Apollo, Apollo
10.
8?
Oh, Apollo
8, when the module arrived from the factory, it was wrapped in blue polythene, and it looked like a giant sweet, like a boiled sweet. So they called it Gumdrop. And the module it sat on was called Spider because it had these big, long, spindly legs. So Apollo 8 was Spider and Gumdrop. And then Apollo 10, the one that might have landed, all the pilots wore these little cloth caps with these black air pads that made them look like Snoopy. So they called the excursion module Snoopy and the command module Charlie Brown. So if they'd landed, it would have been Houston, Tranquility Base here, Snoopy has landed on the moon. And at that point, NASA got involved and went, could you come up with slightly more gravitas in your naming, please? So we got Columbia and Eagle and all these kinds of names.
Okay, so what
5.
The next thing you need to deal with is you've got to take a systems view.
Did we just get a cheer from the back? Yeah. Let's give it up, Margaret Hamilton.
Margaret Hamilton. Right. So, speaking of other presidents who sound like presidents, Obama, when he met Margaret Hamilton, said, our astronauts only had a brief time up there, but they had Margaret Hamilton. She basically wrote the software, or led the team that wrote the software that kind of made it all happen. And at that point, it was not obvious that they needed software. So the only bit we're really talking about software. And these are pilots. They don't need software. They were going to fly to the moon by hand. That was their vision.
Margaret Hamilton's software is the only software ever to have been immortalized in Lego.
Yeah. So we've got 2 of these kits. I've got at home, I've got one, my younger son's got one.
I've got one on top of my monitor at home as well. It's the Lego Women of NASA kit, and it's fantastic. Everyone should have one of these. Yeah. But Margaret Hamilton, although, only recently kind of has her name and her story really come into the public eye, but she was hugely influential in the way that software development has evolved, because she was the first person to use the term software engineering. Up until that point, software was still very much in its infancy as a discipline. And there was this mindset that everything else was hard and difficult, and then you just ran the program on it, and that would be fine, and it's easy to fix and everything. And, she, even back then, realized that you were never going to get to the moon if you regarded software as an afterthought to something as complex as the Saturn Apollo launch vehicle. She started talking about software engineering and advocated something that she called a systems view, wasn't it?
Yeah. So this is the idea. She's basically saying, It's a whole engineering process. It's not just software, it's not just hardware. And we can actually see the degree of interdisciplinary cooperation that is necessary to do this. And so here we've got a schematic. This is Rockwell built the command and service module. But if you actually look at this, this is not just a hunk of metal. There's a bunch of different disciplines here, some of which are genuine your classic rocket science in terms of propulsion. But at the same time, you've got a parachute in there. That's kind of slightly different. That's a very different group of people. That's a very different kind of engineering. If you go through each one of the systems and subsystems, you suddenly realize that you're opening up a whole different discipline of engineering. This all has to work together. You cannot just have people focusing on their little bit. They have to consider it to be holistic. And then this was built by another company. We'll come back to some of the interesting consequences of that. This is Grumman. The Apollo guidance system that Margaret Hamilton and her team at MIT were responsible for was actually the only piece of common hardware between the two. It was actually the same software ran on both. But it used different power systems. I wonder if that's going to cause a problem.
I wonder.
And then the ultimate systems view. One of the classic images of the 1960s is Earthrise. And this was Apollo 8, the first time humans had been out here. And
This photograph was taken by Frank Borman. It's the first time human beings had ever seen Earth at a distance. You know, we talk about outer space. Outer space is closer than Poland, right? Outer space is about 80 kilometers up. That's it. You got 80 Ks up, you're in outer space, and then you can come back. Getting into orbit is hard, and getting out of orbit and into deep space, you know, to beyond the moon and stuff, that was one of the big goals of Apollo. So nobody had ever seen this before, and Frank Borman, who took this photograph, he had this, when you're finally up on the moon, looking back on Earth, all those differences and nationalistic traits are pretty well going to blend, and you're going to get a concept that maybe this really is one world, and why the hell can't we learn to live together like decent people? And, you know, this
is the ultimate systems view.
Yeah.
Okay.
We have this one little planet. It's important. It's the only planet with beer, and we keep trying to screw it up, you know. We need to be careful with it.
Okay, so that looks like duct tape.
That does look like duct tape.
So perhaps indirectly, NASA also learned the lessons of standardization, perhaps immortalized that. So if you're not familiar with that, this is, we'll take a little bit of a sequence here. This is Playdoh. This was Apollo 13.
Gene, we have a situation brewing with the carbon dioxide.
We had a CO2 filter problem on the lunar module.
5 filters on the limb.
Which were meant for 2 guys for a day and a half. So I told the doc.
You're already up to 8 on the gauges. Anything over 15 and you get impaired judgment, blackouts, the beginnings of brain asphyxia.
What about the scrubbers on the command module?
They take square cartridges.
The ones on the limb are round.
Tell me this isn't a government operation.
This just isn't a contingency we've remotely looked at.
Those CO2 levels are going to be getting toxic.
Well, I suggest you gentlemen invent a way to put a square peg in a round hole. Rapidly.
Okay, people, listen up. People upstairs, candidates missed one, and we gotta come through. We gotta find a way to make this fit into the hole for this, using nothing but that. Let's get it organized.
Okay, let's build a filter.
Better get some coffee going, too, someone.
So Apollo 13, so that's from the film, Ron Howard film, 1990s film, rewatched it again
Probably
recently.
best film ever made, by the way.
It really is absolutely magnificent. It's incredibly accurate.
The one interesting detail, Jim Lovell, who was the commander on Apollo 13, he was interviewed after the movie came out, and they said, you know, how true to life is it? And he said they got everything pretty much accurate, apart from the astronauts arguing, because we didn't do that. We were a professional crew who just wanted to save the mission and get home. So we weren't going to fight about anything, but apparently that wasn't dramatic enough for Hollywood. So they had to invent, you know, this bit of tension and alpha male rivalry between the
because
astronauts.
obviously having a spacecraft crippled in space is not dramatic enough. But this is the whole thing. They'd worked out everything else except how do we actually keep them alive? And this whole question of like CO2 is going to get you. This was the standardization issue they had to
Now, there were these
deal with.
two different spacecraft. One flies around the moon, the other one lands on the moon, built by different companies, different specifications. Both companies had to solve the same problem, Because human beings exhale CO2 when we breathe, and if it builds up enough, it's toxic. Now, all you need to do is scrub the CO2 out of the air. Humans can't actually detect a lack of oxygen. That sense you get of suffocating is a buildup of carbon dioxide. That's what leads to the panic and the asphyxia and everything. And they solved it using the same chemical process, which is a thing called lithium hydroxide. You pass air through it and it scrubs out the CO2. But because two separate teams solved it, they ended up with these two different shaped plastic canisters. One of them is this big square one, and the other one's round. Now, it's not about redundancy. They had loads of spare cartridges. They just didn't have the right shape of spares for the spacecraft that was still usable at this point in the mission. And this is probably down to somebody who was on this very stage 4 years ago. Mel Conway. Was anyone here when Mel keynoted here at Build Stuff back in 2015?
Excellent stuff.
So yeah, I took this picture of Mel standing here, and Mel Conway came up with Conway's Law. Organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of these organizations. The reason Apollo had two different shapes of lithium hydroxide canister is because it had two different teams solving the same problem who weren't talking to each other, because they worked for different companies, different briefs, different budgets, and there was no incentive for them to rationalize and solve the same problem.
And just so we can date this, this came from How Do Committees Invent, a paper that was published in 1968. So this is very timely in that sense. So this was not a new idea, but it does also tell us how old the idea is from our point of view. Okay, so now we have this interesting thing. How do you test the fact that you're going to do all of this stuff? You know, it's how do you, this idea of testing, it turns out testing in software is something that is actually relatively easy.
Relatively being the operative term.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. But there's this kind of idea, people always have excuses for doing this. It turns out that NASA did not really fall for excuses. How do we do all of this? How do we test that all of this stuff that we've never done before is actually going to work?
You're familiar with the idea of, sandboxes, staging environments, mocking, test frameworks, test data fixtures, all these kinds of things? NASA took the same approach. They're like, if we can't do it for real, how can we fake it so that when we have to do it for real, it probably works? And they came up with some really, really clever ideas.
Very creative.
This is how they simulated lunar gravity. So they could make sure people could walk and they could test their spacesuits in 1/6 gravity, which you can't get down here on Earth.
And that's kind of important. The tilt is just right so that the force, the effective force and return is going to be the same as it would be on the moon. Of course, you're going to be as dizzy as hell because you're sideways. Your brain is not fooled that way. But in terms of the actual motion, that's actually very authentic.
This is filmed on board a thing called a KC-135. It's an aircraft that flies a big parabolic loop, and it gives you about 35 seconds of free fall. And they tested everything in one of these. They tested the food to make sure crumbs weren't a problem in zero gravity. They tested the toilet facilities. Imagine that job. Testing toilets in zero gravity. That's how you're helping put someone on the moon.
And you got 30 seconds, no pressure. Right? Now, these days, we think of the vomit comet, as it's become known, as being a thing you just train astronauts. They didn't just use it for that. They used it for everything.
Yeah. Have you seen the people? So we had a little clip there of the astronauts testing in giant water tanks. And there's a couple of YouTubers out there going, of course the moon landings were fake. I can see the bubbles. And you're like, no. That's not what this is about. But sometimes, while they were doing all these tests, recovery tests and things, they would simulate just kind of goofing around and doing nothing. They had exercises to say, what if the spacecraft lands in the ocean and it's 3 hours before a recovery ship can get there? So they ran drills. They're like, you're the right stuff. You're the bravest test pilots in America. We need you to lie in a pool for 3 hours so we can make sure it'll be all right. Tough job, eh? But someone's got to do it. It wasn't always that much fun. This
is known as the Flying Bedstead. This was how, because the controls that you're dealing with for the lunar module are unlike any of the other flying experiences that people had up to that point, whether we're talking about propeller planes, jet planes, or importantly, even helicopters. So there's this idea of how do you practice, how do you develop the instinct for maneuvering something of this way? And NASA had a number of these, and these, in fact, Neil Armstrong famously crashed and managed to walk away from one. So he knew exactly what was involved. But there's this whole idea of like, yep, we've got to understand what's that instinct. That flying instinct needs to be developed and is not just going to be developed. Well, they didn't have flight sim the way we have now, but you've got to feel the craft. And how's it going to work? This is quite critical.
And so you have all these different elements of the system which would eventually run in production up there on the moon, every single element they isolated, and they worked out, how can we simulate this? How can we test this? How do we know what's going to happen with this scenario? But even with the best will and the most rigorous testing, they still encountered all kinds of things that probably could not have been anticipated because they had no idea till they did it for real that this was going to happen. There are two kinds of space nerds. There are people who like rockets, and there's people who know what a 1202 alarm is. Kevlin, what's a 1202 alarm?
Okay, so the 1202 alarm, what we've got here is something that on descent, 1202 alarm went off. Now, there were basically 13 minutes from orbit to the surface. There's a lot going on. There is an awful lot going on. 13 minutes, and the 1202 alarm comes up, and you're actually fairly close to touching down on the moon, and there's a lot going on. 1202, what's this? Nobody had ever seen it. It had never come up. So you get out the book, and 1202, it tells you, okay, well, this is a bit of an issue. We've got a 1202, and then you get another 1202. Then you get a 1201. What's going on? It turns out this is some of Margaret Hamilton's genius here. It was a fault-tolerant system. It was an asynchronous executive that she had insisted people put in. Fault-tolerant, basically, what do you do when you've got almost no processing power, but you have a prioritized list of tasks that need to be done? What happens if that task list overflows? Okay, what do you do? And she put in something, and they'd say, oh, well, that's never going to happen. Yeah, but what happens if? So this is basically what she did. What happened is there was spurious data being sent to the executive with filling spurious tasks. It was actually the rendezvous radar. The rendezvous radar used you only need for rendezvous, so you don't need it on landing. So they kind of turned it off, except that it used a different power system to the other power systems. And it started sending noise, which was interpreted as signals. So it starts filling up the task table, which overflows. Fortunately, they had a simple solution to this. Hi, I'm a piece of software. This is too busy. I'm going to reboot.
And you've got to remember that anyone here work on these kind of real-time prioritization systems? Imagine trying to do that on a machine with, what was it, about a 20 kilohertz processor and 32 kilobytes of basically core memory, woven core memory with 15-bit words, because you need the extra bit for parity, because in outer space memory goes wrong all the time because it's unshielded and there's radiation. And even within this, she and her team managed to put together something that was smart enough to figure out, if this happens, then this happens, dump that, ignore that, reboot that bit, do not crash the people into the moon.
These are memory exhaustion. The core is only a few words. That's basically your registers. The VAC is the vector accumulator. And this idea of executive overflow. And when I say reboot, it really did reboot. But it's such a fast reboot that it retains all the data. Now, how many people would be comfortable with that? Okay, so this was the genius. It's just like we ditch the low priority tasks. We just keep the things that are going. We just keep the things that are going. Margaret Hamilton was very good at this. She brought her daughter in to, well, accidentally prove a point. Her daughter would come in sometimes when she was working, Loren, and would play with one of the simulators, and accidentally created a situation that should not occur, which was to instill a pre-launch sequence whilst you're supposed to be in flight to the moon. Turns out what it does is it scrubs all the navigation data. Whilst you're on the way to the moon, that's a really bad thing. You need your navigation data. Margaret Hamilton, so this is known as the Loren Bug, after Loren Hamilton. And Margaret Hamilton pointed this out to her higher-ups. She said, you know, this could happen. I need to put a piece of code in there that basically prevents it from this piece of code being run from after launch. Our astronauts are well-trained. They'll never do that. Apollo 8, they did that. She got permission to put
the buttons were like right next to each other. Anyone could have made that mistake. That was not actually, so several of the key kind of critical moments in the whole Apollo program involved turning it off and on again. And none of them quite so significant as this. Now, unfortunately, there's no really good footage of this. This is Apollo 12, about 40 seconds after launch. It got struck by lightning twice.
Not just once. So that whole thing, when people say, you know, you never get struck by lightning twice.
These three guys in a little metal box on top of 650,000 tons of explosive rocket fuel get struck by lightning. And what happens is the entire console panel goes dark. All the instruments switch off. They have absolutely no clue what's going on. So, you know, with that classic astronaut understatement, Houston, we have a problem. And now they'd never ever simulated a lightning strike, but they had simulated, the people who ran the simulators for mission control were sadists who just sat there going, what can we throw at them today, John? I know, let's fake a complete power failure for the entire Saturn launch vehicle. Yeah, go on, pull the plug out. And so, but they simulated both the astronauts and the mission control desk. They were all part of the simulation. And so they'd seen this complete power failure on a Saturn launch before, and it just happened that one of the astronauts who was flying that is Pete Conrad, wasn't it?
Yeah, there's a 12, yeah.
Pete Conrad was the commander, and there's a guy called John Aaron who worked on the guidance and navigation systems. And John Aaron switched the SE2 to AUX, and nobody knew what that meant, but Pete Conrad knew what it meant, and he reached out, he flicked this one switch. Nobody even else knew where the switch was, and it rebooted the entire rocket. Now, the thing about this, it didn't shut down the engines, because it's hard to switch off a rocket engine once it's going. They have a tendency to kind of just keep going till they burn out. So they rebooted the thing, and they got into orbit. They did a couple of orbits. They kind of made sure everything was all right, and they were like, yeah,
we're good.
It's fine. Struck by lightning twice, but hey, no big deal. Let's go to the moon. You know what Pete Conrad did when he got to the moon? Played golf. He had this surveying rod, one of the pieces of mining equipment, and he got them to make him a golf driver, like a club head, that he could screw onto the end of it, and he took a couple of golf balls up with him, and he played golf on the moon. And it's still not clear whether he would have been able to drive a golf ball into orbit. You can't quite do that from the moon. You can do it from the moons of Mars. On Phobos, you can get to orbit with a skateboard ramp.
Yeah,
That's cool.
You don't need as much speed.
The other thing, the scenarios that they had to plan for, it didn't occur to them until after Apollo 11 had launched.
So notice the date. This is after the launch. The launch was 16th of July. So it's a case of like, but what if it doesn't work out?
Somebody was like, we should probably write some speeches for the president in case something goes wrong. And this speech was written, this was the speech Nixon was going to give in the event that they got stranded on the moon and couldn't bring them home. And what's the wording here? These brave men, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin, know that there is no hope for their recovery, but they know that there is hope for mankind in their sacrifice. And they had a speech for this, and they had a speech for what if it exploded, and they had a speech for what if it crashes into the moon and kills everybody. And fortunately, they didn't need to use any of them.
And these only came to light quite a few years later. And in fact, they're not normally, if you look in older books, they're not normally mentioned. I only discovered this particular one a few years ago, about 10 years ago, and I suddenly thought, holy crap, this is what would have been said. This is how things would have been remembered. These would be the famous words, and so on. But every contingency was ultimately planned. But it's never too late. Even when you're in flight, what do we do if it goes wrong? Okay, now is a good time to think about it.
I think it's telling, one, that they did actually anticipate this, but two, they didn't think of it until 2 days after the launch.
Yeah.
That's agile for you.
Yeah. Just in time.
All right, they're in space. Now we need speeches for what happens if they get stuck in space. They didn't need them yesterday because the launch might not have worked. Just in time delivery.
Now, this is a really key role, CAPCOM. This is Charlie Duke that you're looking at here. CAPCOM is short for Capsule Communicator. There's this idea that if you look at any representation of mission control, there's a lot going on. There's a lot of activity. There's a lot of voices. There's a lot of people. There's a lot of disciplines. You have medical. You have guidance. You have all of these people focusing on things. You don't want any of that going out, that chaos, as it were.
Have you ever
going out to the astronauts?
One of those days at work where, like, you get in and one person says, "Oh, you need to do this first. No, do this report. No, don't do that report. Do this report. Can you move that button to the left? No, move the button to the right. Take the button off. Here's the new color scheme. No, we're using the old color scheme." And you have no idea what you're supposed to be doing right now. Now, you imagine that scenario, but you're halfway to the moon, and you have half a dozen different bosses all telling you what to do. That's not going to work. And so the Capcoms were all astronauts. They were people who'd been through the same training, and normally they would be like in line to fly the subsequent mission or the one after that. So these were people, they'd been through the same training, same simulations, same concerns. They understood the same terminology. They were the only ones allowed to talk to the crew. You want to talk to Eagle or Columbia, you go through the capsule communicator, and they are the person who says, no, that contradicts what they've just been told.
At that point, they are the voice of mission control. The customer, we would be lovely if the customer spoke with a single voice. We have these ideas which keep getting put in, but one unified voice. No matter what the chaos is, we have a clear message. Charlie Duke is actually also famous for then in Apollo 16, he then took country music to the moon. He took a whole load of cassette tapes, and Merle Haggard, I think, was in there.
One of
Dolly
humanity's
Parton.
horrible mistakes.
Yeah, so he took it to the moon but didn't leave it there.
All right, and countdown, 0, liftoff. It is the user journey that matters. You know, we're geeking out here about all kinds of little cool engineering anecdotes and rocket stories and Margaret Hamilton and guidance systems. But most people don't care about any of that stuff. What most people remember is this: a human footprint on the surface of the moon. That is the story. All of this technology, you know, the planning, the missions, the technology, the simulations, all of that existed so that we could tell this story. Human beings set foot on the moon. And when you're working on, you know, whatever stuff you're doing with your teams and your organizations, it's easy to lose sight. What's the story you want someone to tell after they used your product, your system, your platform? Do you want them going, oh, we deployed the Cyberdyne 224B and it increased something by, or do you want them going, check this out, it's awesome. Look, let me show you on my laptop. I got this amazing new plugin. Check out what this does. You know, you ever see one of those things when one of the weird things when Uber first launched in the UK, it was the first thing I'd ever seen where you could take a photograph of your credit card with your phone, and people showed that off in bars. They'd be like, check this out. It can get your card number instead of you having to type it in. And that was such a trivial piece of like user experience design. But people loved it because they'd never seen it before. That was part of this interesting story which led to the kind of viral word-of-mouth growth. And it's easy to lose sight of those kinds of user experiences. The only time people remember technology, you know, can anyone here name a nuclear power station? Is it Chernobyl? Or is it 3 Mile Island? You know, can anyone name a nuclear power station that didn't explode? You know, you ask people, can you name a real space rocket? They're like Challenger, Columbia, Apollo 13. We remember technology when it fails. When technology works, what we remember is the stories that we enabled, the things which became possible because of all of those people working together to accomplish those goals and outcomes. And with that, we're done.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we have any Slido, please? Thank you, Build Stuff.